The Galactic Academy of Sciences had stood on the planet Velthara for over 800,000 years, and in all that time, it had never seen a student quite like Lieutenant Hannah Price. She sat in the third row of the Advanced Stellar Cartography seminar, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, watching Commander Zyrith Velnor with calm, steady eyes that revealed nothing of what she was thinking. Around her, students from 6 different alien species worked frantically to capture every word the commander spoke, their various appendages moving across data tablets and recording devices with desperate speed, because the knowledge being shared in this room had taken centuries to develop. The Velthari were considered the finest teachers in the known galaxy, and Commander Zyrith was among the best of them, his crystalline body catching the light as he moved across the front of the lecture hall, explaining gravitational mapping techniques that his people had perfected. Over 400 years of careful study, Hannah's tablet sat dark and silent on her desk. She had not touched it once since the lecture began. Commander Zyrith noticed this halfway through his explanation of gravitational lens calculations, and he stopped mid-sentence, his crystalline face turning toward the human woman with an expression that suggested confusion mixed with something that might have been irritation. "Lieutenant Price," he said, his voice carrying the strange harmonic resonance that all Velthari possessed, "is there a problem with your recording equipment?" "No, sir," Hannah replied, her tone polite but utterly unconcerned. "Then perhaps you would explain why you are not documenting this information," Zyrith continued, gesturing at the complex equations floating in the air behind him. "The gravitational lens calculations I am presenting took our people 4 centuries to perfect, and they form the foundation of modern stellar navigation." The other students had stopped their frantic note-taking to watch this exchange, and Hannah could feel their eyes on her, could sense their confusion and in some cases their amusement at the human who apparently thought she was too good to learn from a Velthari master. "With respect, Commander," Hannah said, meeting his gaze without flinching, "I am familiar with gravitational lens calculations." A ripple of surprise moved through the lecture hall like a wave, and the Korvathi delegate in the back row, a being made primarily of dense magnetic fields that shifted and pulsed with his emotions, flickered with what Zyrith recognized as open amusement. "You are familiar with them?" Zyrith repeated slowly, each word precise and careful. "Yes, sir. Lieutenant, humans have only been spacefaring for 200 years, Zyrith said, and there was something in his voice now that might have been disbelief or might have been condescension. "Your species has barely left your own solar system's neighborhood, and you claim to be familiar with calculations that took the Velthari 4 centuries to develop." "That is correct, Commander." Zyrith's crystalline form pulsed with light, a sign of agitation that Hannah had learned to recognize during her 3 weeks at the academy, and he took a step toward her, his eyes locked on hers. "Perhaps you would care to elaborate on how this is possible." Hannah uncrossed her arms and leaned forward slightly in her seat, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and clear and carried to every corner of the room. "We have been doing math for a lot longer than we have been flying starships, Commander." The silence that followed her words was absolute. Even the Korvathi delegate had stopped flickering. Captain Lucas Ward had warned Hannah before she left Earth that the Galactic Academy would test her patience in ways she could not imagine. Understand exactly what he had meant. The galaxy's older species had a particular way of looking at humans, a mixture of curiosity and condescension that came from beings who had been traveling between stars while humans were still figuring out how to make fire. They expected humans to be grateful for every scrap of knowledge shared with them. They expected humans to sit quietly and take notes and marvel at the wonders being revealed to them. They did not expect humans to already know things. Commander Zyrith recovered his composure with visible effort, his crystalline body settling into a more neutral configuration as he processed what Hannah had said. You are claiming, he said carefully, that humans have independently developed gravitational lens calculations equivalent to Velthari methods. I am not claiming anything, Commander, Hannah replied. I am simply stating that I am already familiar with the material you are teaching. Do not need to take notes. That is a remarkable statement, Lieutenant. It is an accurate one, sir. The Dranathi student 2 rows ahead of Hannah turned to look at her. Bioluminescent patterns rippling across his skin in shades of orange and gold that indicated surprise and skepticism, and Hannah met his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had shown Commander Zyrith. She was not trying to cause trouble. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. She was simply telling the truth, and if that truth made people uncomfortable, that was not her problem. Commander Zyrith studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Something that Hannah could not quite read, but that felt significant. Very well, Lieutenant Price, he said finally. If you are already familiar with this material, perhaps you would be willing to demonstrate your knowledge. Of course, Commander. Excellent, Zyrith said, and he gestured toward the display at the front of the room. Please come forward and solve this navigational problem using gravitational lens calculations. Hannah rose from her seat and walked to the front of the lecture hall, aware of every eye in the room following her movement, aware of the weight of expectation and doubt pressing down on her from every direction. The problem Zyrith had displayed was complex, involving the navigation of a theoretical ship through a region of space filled with gravitational anomalies, and solving it would require exactly the kind of calculations he had just been teaching. Hannah studied the display for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she began to work. Her fingers moved across the interface with practiced ease, entering equations and adjusting variables, and numbers cascaded across the screen in a waterfall of mathematical precision. The other students watched in stunned silence as she worked, and even Commander Zyrith seemed frozen in place, his crystalline body motionless as the human lieutenant demonstrated knowledge that should have been impossible for her species to possess. Hannah finished her calculations in less than 2 minutes. The navigation route appeared on screen, clean and elegant and mathematically perfect. Commander Zyrith stared at the display for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. This is correct. Yes, Commander, Hannah said. It is. She returned to her seat without another word, and the lecture continued, but something had changed in the room, something fundamental that could not be taken back. The human had not just answered a question. She had challenged everything the Galactic Academy believed about the relationship between older species and younger ones. And that challenge was only the beginning. News traveled fast at the Galactic Academy, faster even than the ships that carried students and teachers between the stars. And by the following morning, everyone knew about the human who had embarrassed Commander Zyrith Velnor in his own classroom. The story grew with each telling, as stories often do, and by the time it reached the ears of Admiral Keth Marath of the High Council's Educational Committee, it had transformed into something that sounded almost like a declaration of war. Admiral Marath was Dranathi, his body covered in bioluminescent patterns that shifted with his moods. And right now those patterns were cycling through shades of deep blue and purple that indicated formal displeasure and serious concern. He summoned the human delegation to his office that same afternoon. Captain Lucas Ward arrived first, his uniform pressed and perfect, his face carefully neutral in the way that military officers learn to maintain when dealing with superiors. Authorities, and Lieutenant Hannah Price walked beside him, looking neither nervous nor apologetic. 4 of the most decorated educators in galactic history sat across the polished table from them, and the weight of their collective disapproval filled the room like a physical presence. We understand there was a disruption in Commander Velnor's seminar yesterday, Admiral Marath began, his patterns settling into something cold and formal. There was no disruption, Admiral, Lucas said, his voice calm and measured. Lieutenant Price simply indicated that she was already familiar with the material being taught. That in itself is a disruption, Captain Ward. Professor Yenna Cree, the Academy's senior astrophysicist, leaned forward in her seat, her elongated fingers pressed together in front of her, in a gesture that conveyed both authority and skepticism. The gravitational mapping techniques Commander Velnor teaches are proprietary Velthari methods. Said, they have never been shared outside our species, and they certainly have not been shared with humans. Hannah agreed, speaking for the first time since entering the room. We developed them independently. The silence that followed her words was so complete that Hannah could hear the soft hum of the station's environmental systems, could hear her own heartbeat steady and slow in her chest. Independently, Professor Cree repeated, and there was something in her voice that might have been anger or might have been fear. Yes, Professor. Admiral Morath's patterns shifted rapidly through a series of colors that Hannah did not recognize, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its formal coldness and taken on an edge of genuine confusion. You expect us to believe that humans developed in a few decades what took the Velthari 4 centuries to perfect. I do not expect anything, Admiral, Hannah said. I am simply telling you what happened. Hannah considered the question carefully before answering, aware that her words would be analyzed and debated and picked apart by some of the finest minds in the galaxy. About 60 years ago, a physicist named Patricia Hall published a paper on gravitational field interactions, she said. Her work was built on the foundation of mathematics that humans had been developing for thousands of years, and it opened up entirely new possibilities for stellar navigation. One paper, Professor Cree said, her voice flat with disbelief. One paper that sparked a revolution, Hannah confirmed. Within a decade, we had teams of mathematicians and physicists working on applications, and within 2 decades, we had functional gravitational mapping systems. That is impossible, said Professor Cree. And yet it happened, Hannah said. Admiral Morath rose from his seat and walked to the window that looked out over the Academy's sprawling campus, his patterns cycling through colors that Hannah could not interpret. And when he turned back to face her, there was something new in his expression, something that looked almost like respect. You say you developed these methods independently, he said. Can you prove this? Yes, Admiral. How? Hannah glanced at Captain Ward, who gave her a small nod of permission, and then she stood and walked to the display terminal at the side of the room. If you will allow me to access your navigational database, I can demonstrate exactly what human gravitational mapping looks like. The Admiral hesitated for only a moment before nodding his consent, and Hannah's fingers began to move across the interface. She pulled up a star chart of the Velarin Nebula, a region of space known for its complex gravitational anomalies and dangerous navigation challenges, and the 4 educators leaned forward in their seats. To watch. According to the standard gravitational mapping techniques taught at this academy, Hannah said, plotting a safe navigation route through the Velarin Nebula requires approximately 38 separate calculations. 38 is correct, Commander Zyrith confirmed from his seat at the end of the table. Human methods can do it in 12. Professor Cree actually laughed, a sharp sound of pure disbelief, but her laughter died in her throat as Hannah's fingers continued to move and numbers began cascading across the screen. The calculations were elegant in their simplicity, each equation building on the one before it, and the 4 educators watched in stunned silence as the human lieutenant demonstrated mathematical techniques that should not have existed. The navigation route appeared on screen in less than 90 seconds. It was clean and precise and mathematically flawless. Professor Cree stood slowly, her eyes fixed on display, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. That is not possible, she whispered. It is running right now, Professor. But the computational requirements alone should be— We found ways around them, Hannah said simply. We had to, because we did not have centuries to develop more elegant solutions. Admiral Morath's patterns had settled into a solid shade of deep gold, a color that Hannah had never seen on a Drenathi before, and when he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "How did you do this?" "We were desperate, Admiral." Hannah turned away from the display and faced the four educators directly, and there was something in her eyes that made even the Admiral take a step back. "Humans have never had the luxury of time," she said. "We have never had millions of years to slowly develop our understanding of the universe, and we have never had the safety of knowing that we could afford to make mistakes." Calculations still floating on the screen behind her. Every mathematical breakthrough in human history came from people who were trying to solve problems that might kill them if they failed, she continued. "We learned to work fast because we had no other choice, and somewhere along the way, we discovered that desperation is a very effective teacher." The room was silent for a long moment, and then Admiral Morath spoke again. "Lieutenant Price, I think we need to have a much longer conversation about exactly what humans have learned during your short time among the stars." Hannah met his gaze without flinching. "I think you are right, Admiral." The formal investigation began 3 days after Hannah's demonstration in Admiral Morath's office, and it quickly became the most significant inquiry in the Academy's 800,000-year history. Senior analyst Derek Cole was assigned to lead the Human Studies team, a position he had not asked for and did not particularly want, but he understood why he had been chosen. He was human, which meant he could provide insight into his own species that no alien investigator could match. And he had spent the last 5 years working at the Academy, which meant he understood both sides of the growing divide. His partner on the investigation was investigator Threl Vasson, a Korvathi whose magnetic field body pulsed with constant energy, and who specialized in technological assessment for species that had recently achieved spacefaring capability. They worked out of a small office on the Academy's research level, surrounded by data terminals and holographic displays. And, for the first 2 weeks, they did nothing but read. "I have completed my review of the Human Educational Archives," Threl reported during their third formal meeting, his magnetic form flickering with colors that indicated surprise and confusion. "What they are claiming appears to be accurate." Derek spread his hands in a gesture of helpless confirmation. "We have been trying to tell you," he said. "We are not hiding anything, and we are not exaggerating our capabilities." "That is precisely what concerns me, Analyst Cole." Threl moved to the central display and pulled up a timeline that Derek had seen many times before, a visual representation of human scientific advancement, from the discovery of fire to the development of faster-than-light travel. "Your species has been developing mathematics, physics, and engineering for approximately 10,000 years, Threl said. "In that time you have independently recreated discoveries that took other species millions of years to achieve." "We had good teachers," Derek said, with a slight smile that did not reach his eyes. "You had no teachers," Threl corrected, his form pulsing with agitation. "That is precisely the point, and that is precisely what makes this situation so disturbing." He expanded the timeline until it filled the entire display, and Derek found himself looking at the full scope of galactic history, with humanity's brief existence represented as a tiny sliver at the very end. "The Valthari spacefaring civilization is 800,000 years old," Threl said. "They developed faster-than-light travel after 600,000 years of careful scientific advancement, building slowly and steadily on the work of countless generations." He pointed to the human timeline. "Humans achieved the same result in 10,000 years, starting from nothing, with no guidance from more advanced species." "Expectations," Derek shrugged. "We were motivated." "You were terrified," Threl corrected, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like admiration. "Every time we examine your history, we find the same pattern repeated over and over again." He pulled up a series of images that Derek recognized immediately, scenes from human history that had been studied and analyzed by alien researchers for decades. War drives innovation, Threll said, highlighting conflicts that had led to technological breakthroughs. Disaster drives adaptation, he continued, showing natural catastrophes that had forced humans to develop new survival strategies. Your species treats every problem like it might kill you, because historically, that is exactly what happened. Does that bother you? Derek asked. Threll was quiet for a long moment, his magnetic form settling into a steady pulse that indicated deep thought. It should bother everyone, he said. Finally. The investigation continued for 3 more months, and with each passing week, the scope of what they were discovering grew larger and more unsettling. Derek spent his days reviewing human scientific papers and comparing them to galactic standards, and he found the same pattern that Threll had identified. Humans solving problems faster than should have been possible, finding shortcuts and workarounds that older species had never considered. This is the paper that Patricia Hall published 60 years ago, Derek said during one of their late-night working sessions, pulling up the document on the central display. It is the foundation of human gravitational mapping. Threll studied the equations for a long moment. This is elegant work, he admitted, but it should not exist. Why not? Because the mathematical frameworks required to develop these equations typically take a species at least 50,000 years to establish, Threll said. Humans develop them in less than 5,000. Derek leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes, tired from too many hours of reading and too little sleep. We did not have 50,000 years, he said simply. I know. So we found another way. Threll's form pulsed with something that Derek had learned to recognize as frustration mixed with admiration. That is what I do not understand, the Korvathi said. Every other species in the galaxy follows a predictable pattern of development, building knowledge slowly over time, making incremental advances that eventually add up to significant breakthroughs. He gestured at the human timeline, still floating on the display. Humans do not follow that pattern, he continued. You make enormous leaps in understanding, often in response to crises, and you do it so quickly that our models cannot predict your advancement. Is that a problem? It is not a problem, he said finally. It is a warning. Derek sat up straighter in his chair. A warning about what? About what humans might become if they continue developing at this rate, Threll said. And his magnetic form pulsed with colors that Derek had never seen before. Colors that might have been fear or might have been excitement. Your species has achieved in 10,000 years what took the Velthari 800,000, and you show no signs of slowing down. He turned to face Derek directly. The galaxy has never seen anything like humanity, he said, and I do not think the galaxy is prepared for what you will become. Derek thought about Hannah Price and her refusal to take notes in Commander Zirit's classroom. Thought about the gravitational calculations she had completed in 90 seconds. Thought about the look on Professor Kree's face when she realized that humans had surpassed her people's achievements in a fraction of the time. Maybe that is exactly what the galaxy needs, he said quietly. Threll's form flickered with something that might have been agreement. Maybe it is, he admitted. But that does not make it any less terrifying. 3 months after the investigation began, the Galactic Council made a decision that surprised everyone, including Lieutenant Hannah Price herself. They asked her to deliver a guest lecture at the Academy. The topic was left entirely to her discretion, and after several days of careful thought, Hannah chose to speak about something that no alien species had ever truly understood. She chose to speak about how humans learn. The main auditorium of the Galactic Academy was the largest enclosed space Hannah had ever seen, capable of holding over 10,000 beings of various shapes and sizes. And on the day of her lecture, every seat was filled. Species from across the galaxy had crowded into the massive room, squeezed into seats designed for bodies very different from their own. All of them, eager to hear what the human had to say. Commander Zirith Velnor sat in the front row, his crystalline face turned toward the stage with an expression that Hannah could not quite read, and beside him sat Professor Kree and Admiral Morath and dozens of other Academy leaders who had come to witness this moment. Hannah stepped up to the podium without notes. She had never needed notes, not for anything important, and this was possibly the most important speech of her life. I have been asked many times since I arrived at this academy why I was not taking notes during Commander Velnor's lectures, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. The answer is simple, and I gave it on my first day here. She paused and looked out at the sea of alien faces, watching her with expressions of curiosity and skepticism and something that might have been fear. You were teaching my summary reports. A murmur ran through the crowd, thousands of beings reacting to her words, and Hannah waited for the sound to fade before continuing. I do not mean that literally, of course, she said. I had not written the specific documents Commander Velnor was using, and I had not studied the exact calculations he was presenting. But the principles behind those calculations, the methods and approaches, and fundamental understanding of how gravity interacts with stellar bodies, those were all things that humans figured out decades ago. She pulled up an image on the massive display behind her, and 10,000 pairs of eyes turned to look at it. It showed a human child, perhaps 8 years old, sitting at a small desk with a mathematics workbook open in front of her, her face scrunched in concentration, as she struggled with a problem that was clearly too difficult for her. This is how humans learn, Hannah said. We do not have crystalline neural networks that can store perfect information for thousands of years, and we do not have magnetic field bodies that can process calculations instantaneously. She tapped her forehead. We have these, she said. Soft, fragile, organic. Computers that forget things and make mistakes and get confused, and sometimes simply refuse to work properly. A few beings in the audience made sounds that might have been laughter, and Hannah allowed herself a small smile before continuing. Our brains are not designed for learning, she said. They are designed for survival, for recognizing threats and finding food and navigating social relationships. And somewhere along the way, we figured out how to trick them into doing mathematics and physics and engineering. She changed the image on the display, replacing the struggling child with a photograph of a human scientist working in a laboratory, surrounded by equipment and papers and the controlled chaos of active research. Every piece of knowledge that humans possess was earned through struggle, Hannah continued. Every mathematical formula, every scientific principle, every engineering technique, all of it came from people who fought against the limitations of their own minds to understand something new. She looked out at the audience, at the ancient beings who had accumulated knowledge over millions of years, who had built civilizations that spanned galaxies, while humans were still learning to walk upright. You have all had millions of years to develop your technologies, she said. Humans have had 10,000, and most of that time was spent just trying not to die. She changed the image again, and now the display showed a timeline of human scientific advancement, compressed into a single visual that started with cave paintings and ended with faster-than-light starships. That is not a disadvantage, Hannah said. It is a filter. The murmur that ran through the crowd this time was louder, more confused, and Hannah waited for it to settle before explaining. Every generation of humans grows up knowing that the things we learn today might save our lives tomorrow, she said. We do not have the luxury of slow, careful progress, because slow progress means death, means extinction, means the end of everything we have built. She gestured at the timeline behind her. That pressure, that constant awareness of our own fragility, makes us very good at learning quickly, she continued. We cannot afford to spend centuries developing new techniques, so we find ways to do it faster, and in the process, we discover shortcuts and optimizations that species with more time would never think to look for. Commander Zereth raised his hand, and Hannah nodded in his direction. Lieutenant Price, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, are you suggesting that human educational methods are superior to Velthari methods? No, Commander, Hannah replied. I am suggesting that they are different. She turned to face him directly, and something passed between them in that moment. Some understanding that had been building since her first day in his classroom. Your methods produce deep, lasting knowledge accumulated over centuries, she said. They create experts who understand their fields with a completeness that humans can only dream of achieving, and that knowledge has built civilizations that have endured for longer than my species has existed. She paused. Our methods produce rapid adaptation under pressure, she continued. They create people who can solve problems quickly, who can find new approaches when old ones fail, who can survive in situations where careful, methodical thinking would mean death. She looked out at the audience again. Both approaches work, she said. But when we came to this academy expecting to learn things we did not know, we were disappointed to find that we had already figured most of it out, just using different words and different notation. A voice called out from somewhere in the back of the auditorium, loud enough to carry over the crowd. Then what can we possibly teach you? Hannah smiled, and it was a real smile this time, not the careful diplomatic expression she had worn throughout most of her time at the academy. That is the question I was hoping someone would ask, she said. She changed the image on the display one final time, and now it showed something that made the entire auditorium fall silent. It showed a human and a Velthari working together at a research station, their faces illuminated by the glow of shared calculations, their bodies leaning toward each other in the universal posture of collaboration and discovery. You can teach us patience, Hannah said quietly. You can teach us how to think in centuries instead of years, how to build knowledge that will last forever, instead of just long enough to solve the immediate problem. She looked at Commander Zereth, and maybe, if you are willing, we can teach you how to move a little faster when you need to. The applause started. Slowly, a few beings in the front rows bringing their appendages together in the gesture of approval. And then it spread through the auditorium like a wave, until 10,000 voices were raised in something that sounded almost like hope. 6 months after Lieutenant Hannah Price delivered her lecture to the Galactic Academy, the galaxy changed forever. The Galactic Council convened in the Great Chamber on Velthara Prime, a vast circular room where representatives from every spacefaring species gathered to make decisions that would shape the future of civilization itself. And on this particular day, they had gathered to vote on something unprecedented. The Human Integration Initiative. Captain Lucas Ward stood at the center of the chamber, flanked by Senior Analyst Derek Cole and Lieutenant Hannah Price, facing an audience of beings who had ruled the stars for millions of years before humans had even learned to use tools. What we are proposing, Lucas said, his voice steady and clear, is not a one-way exchange of knowledge. He gestured at the holographic displays that surrounded him, showing data and charts and projections that the human delegation had spent months preparing. Long. The Academy has operated on the assumption that older civilizations have more to teach younger ones, he continued. That assumption is true in many ways, and we do not dispute the value of the knowledge that has been shared with us. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was harder, more confident. But humans had something to offer as well. Admiral Morat's bioluminescent patterns shifted through colors that indicated curiosity and cautious interest. And what exactly is that, Captain Ward? Hannah stepped forward, taking her place beside Lucas at the center of the chamber. Speed, she said simply. The word hung in the air for a moment, and then Hannah continued. You have spent millions of years carefully developing technologies and accumulating knowledge, she said. You have built slowly and methodically, layer upon layer, until your civilizations reached heights that we can barely imagine. She gestured at Derek. Activated the next series of displays. We have spent 10,000 years desperately cobbling together whatever worked, Hannah continued. We have made mistakes and suffered setbacks and lost entire generations of progress to war and disaster. But along the way, we have found shortcuts and optimizations and alternative approaches that you never considered. She looked out at the assembled representatives. Because you never needed to, she finished. Commander Zyrith rose from his seat in the Velthari delegation, his crystalline form catching the light of the chamber. I have worked with Lieutenant Price extensively over the past months, he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the room. When she first arrived in my classroom and refused to take notes, I was offended, and I believe she was arrogant and dismissive of our accomplishments. He paused, and his crystalline body flickered with something that might have been embarrassment. Was wrong, P. The chamber fell absolutely silent. What I mistook for arrogance was simply confidence, Zyrith continued. Confidence born from a species that has never had the luxury of slow, careful progress. Confidence earned through 10,000 years of solving problems that might kill them if they failed. He turned to face Hannah directly. Humans learn quickly because they must, he said, and in doing so, they have developed insights that we, in our long centuries of careful study, never thought to look for. P. Derek activated the final series of displays, showing over 300 areas where human methods could potentially improve or accelerate existing galactic research. P. Over the past 6 months, he said, human analysts have reviewed the Academy's curriculum and compared it to our own scientific development, and we have identified significant opportunities for collaboration in nearly every field of study. P. Professor Cree leaned forward in her seat, her elongated fingers pressed together in front of her. You are suggesting that humans could improve upon our scientific methods? Not improve, Lucas said carefully. Complement. He gestured at the displays. Your knowledge is deeper than ours will ever be, he said. You have had millions of years to explore every corner of your fields, to understand every nuance and subtlety, to build frameworks of understanding that human minds can barely comprehend. He paused. But our methods are faster, he continued. We have learned to find solutions under pressure, to cut corners when necessary, to prioritize results over elegance when survival is at stake. He looked out at the assembled representatives. Combining both approaches could produce results that neither of us could achieve alone. The debate that followed lasted for hours, with representatives from dozens of species raising concerns and asking questions and demanding clarifications. But through it all, Hannah noticed something that gave her hope. They were listening, not dismissing, not condescending, not treating humans as children who needed to be taught. They were actually listening. When the vote was finally called, Admiral Morath rose to deliver the result, his bioluminescent patterns cycling through colors that Hannah had never seen before. The motion passes, he said, and his voice carried a weight of history that made the chamber fall silent. The Human Integration Initiative will proceed. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy rising to their feet, or their appendages, or whatever they used for standing, all of them talking at once, in a cacophony of celebration and confusion and hope. Hannah turned to Lucas, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears. Think they are ready for what we will teach them? Assembled delegates, at beings who had ruled the stars for millions of years, all of them suddenly eager to learn from the youngest spacefaring species in known history. I think, he said slowly, they are about to find out just how fast humans can move when we are not the ones playing catch-up. Hannah smiled and pulled out her tablet, the same tablet that had sat dark and unused in Commander Zyrit's classroom all those months ago. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she began taking notes. There was finally something worth writing down. Commander Zyrith approached them as the chamber began to empty, his crystalline form glowing with colors that indicated genuine warmth. "Lieutenant Price," he said, "I believe I owe you an apology." Hannah shook her head. "You owe me nothing, Commander." "I underestimated your species," Zyrith said. "I assumed that because you were young, you had nothing to teach us." "Wrong." He extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting that he had learned during their months of working together. "I look forward to learning from you." Hannah took his hand and shook it firmly. "And I look forward to learning from you, Commander," she said. "There is still so much we do not know." Zyrith's crystalline face shifted into something that might have been a smile. "Then let us discover it together." They walked out of the chamber side by side, human and Velthari, teacher and student, and partners in a collaboration that would change the galaxy forever. Behind them, the lights of the great chamber dimmed, but somewhere in the distance, stars were burning brighter than they had in millions of years. The future had arrived, and it was moving faster than anyone had expected.